We are the Ministry of the Real Truth, and here is the companion to the revised version of the New Testament, explaining the reasons for the changes made on the authorized version, i.e. the King James Version, by Alex Roberts, D.D., Professor of Humanities, St. Andrews, and member of the English New Testament Company. We tried to find information on this particular author, or translator, Alexander Roberts. He was a 19th century Scottish Bible scholar. We didn't really find much about him. He trained as a minister of the Free Church of Scotland at New College, Edinburgh from 1849 to 1851. He was minister of the Free Church in Stonehaven from 1852 to 1857. In 1857 he was translated to the Free Scots Church in Carlton, London. What that means is he was basically moved to, or transported to, or he went to. In 1864 he was awarded an honorary doctorate, Doctor of Divinity, by Edinburgh University. He was also a minister at St. John's Wood and was a member of the New Testament Revision Company 1870 to 1884. In 1871 he succeeded John Campbell Sharp as Professor of Humanity at the University of St. Andrews. He was made Emeritus Professor on his retirement in 1889. He died at Mitcham Park, Surrey, on 8 March 1901. He was returned to St. Andrews for burial and lies in the south-east corner of the churchyard of St. Andrews Cathedral. His family, who he married, who he was survived by. He had 14 children, of whom 4 sons. 4 sons and 8 daughters survived him. Of note, his daughter Margaret Spinks Robert married George Samuel Nuth, who that was, principal of New College, London. He was a chemist. Works. Roberts' Discussion on the Gospels, published in 1862, one of a series of works in which he maintained that Greek was the habitual speech of Jesus, a conclusion unpopular at the time. He cooperated with Sir James Donaldson as editor and part translator of the English version of ecclesiastical writers, published as the Ante-Nicene Christian Library, etc., the first major edition in English of these church fathers. He also translated the works of Sulpicius Severus, 1895, in the Select Library of Nicene and Post-Nicene Fathers. Roberts also wrote Companion to the Revised Version of the New Testament, explaining the reasons for the changes made on the Authorized Version, 1881. This is the one that we're looking at. Contents page. Part 3, the Anglo-American Revision by an American Reviser. Preface. The object of this little work is to explain to the English reader the general grounds of those many departures from the Authorized Version, or the King James Version, which he will find in the Revised Translation. Not one of these alterations has been made without what appeared to be a majority of the revisers' inadequate reason. They are all to be traced to one or other of 2 causes, either to a change of the Greek text which it was found necessary to adopt, or to a change of translation which stricter fidelity to the original seemed to require. Under these 2 heads, all necessary explanations, so far as space permitted, will be found in the following pages. For the sake of those who are acquainted with the original, the Greek words referred to have been sometimes given at the bottom of the page, but the text will be perfectly intelligible without these to the English reader. It is scarcely needful to add that for what is here written, the author alone is responsible. St. Andrews. Preface to the American edition. Dr. Roberts, a member of the English Committee of Revision, has prepared a companion to the Revised Version of the English New Testament. This is an instructive and useful explanation of the departures from the Authorized Version, but is silent about the American appendix and the relation of the American Committee to the whole work. It is therefore desirable to supply this defect by such additional information as can be published, without a breach of confidence, in the interest of both committees, which have so far harmoniously and successfully completed their joint task. The writer has been urged to prepare this pamphlet by a number of friends and fellow revisers at the time, but is or was alone responsible for the opinions expressed and disclaims any official authority. The New Testament Company has adjourned sine die and is not likely to convene again unless a special emergency should call them together. An official history of the whole movement cannot be issued until the revision of the Old Testament is completed, and that was in New York, May 1881. Part 1. Changes arising from an amended text or a corrected text. Companion to the revised version of the English New Testament, Chapter 1. Various readings in the New Testament. The number of various readings in the New Testament has been differently estimated at different times, nor could this have been otherwise. Every new manuscript which is discovered increases the amount, and every more accurate examination of already known manuscripts tends to the same result. Hence, while the varieties of reading in the New Testament reckoned at about 30,000 in the last century, they are generally referred to as amounting to no less than 150,000 at the present day, in his era, 1800s, towards the end of it. This is a statement which is apt at first to be felt alarming by those unacquainted with the science of biblical criticism. They are naturally disposed to ask, when so many differences of reading exist, must not the sacred text be very uncertain? But happily this is a question which can be very easily and satisfactorily answered. For, in the first place, the vast majority of the various readings are of no practical importance. Multitudes of them are mere errors in spelling into which the writer has fallen, either from his ear having deceived him if he wrote from dictation, or his eye having mistaken one letter for another in the manuscript which lay before him. Others consist of the substitution of one synonymous word for another, or of a mere change of order without any appreciable distinction of sense. As in English, the meaning is the same whether we say he went forth or he went out, let us go on or let us proceed, the enemy escaped or the enemy made the escape. So is it very frequently in the Greek. And just as it makes no difference in our language whether we say Paul the Apostle or the Apostle Paul, the poet Milton or Milton the poet, so too is it with a large number of those variations which occur in the text of the New Testament. But, in the second place, so far from the immense variety of readings which have been collected giving rise to uncertainty, the very fact that we possess these constitutes our best hope of being able to approach to certainty with respect to the original text. This may appear a paradoxical statement, but it admits of easy demonstration. For let us refer to any of those ancient writings in the printed text of which there exist no various readings. Are such texts trustworthy and pure? Nay, or no, the very opposite is the case. They are all hopelessly corrupt, and the reason is evident. There are no varieties of reading simply because these works have come down to us in a single manuscript only. That manuscript is the sole authority to which appeal can be made as to their text, and of course, if every printed edition is taken from that, without conjecture, venturing to make any changes, all the copies will be exactly alike. But nothing could be more calamitous to an ancient author than such a circumstance. His work, having been transcribed so often in the course of many centuries, has, of necessity, become disfigured with numerous errors, and, as it survives in only one manuscript, there is no possibility of comparison, and no means of correction, except by the arbitrary process of conjecture, which will always vary with different minds. The consequence is that all sorts of guesses are made by editors as to the true text of these unfortunate writings. While there are, for the reasons stated, no various readings, there is the utmost variety of conjectures. Everyone feels that the existing text is in multitudes of passages corrupt, and from want of documentary evidence has no resource but to proceed to correct it, just as his caprice or judgment may suggest. How different does the case stand in regard to the New Testament? No miracle has been wrought to preserve its text as it came from the pens of the inspired writers. Well, it actually has been preserved through the original Galilean Aramaic, manuscripts hidden from the Emperor Constantine Roman Catholic Church, therefore preserved by the Apostolic Church of the East for over 2,000 years. That would have been a thing altogether out of harmony with God's method of governing the world. The manuscripts containing a record of the divine will have been left, like others, to suffer from those causes of error which will presently be mentioned. It's probably errors in translation. But a gracious providence has nevertheless been exerted in connection with the text of the New Testament. It has been so ordered that vastly more copies of the sacred volume have come down to us in manuscript than of any other ancient writing. We learn from the best authorities on the subject that no fewer than 1,760 manuscripts of the New Testament, in whole or in parts, are unknown to scholars in our day. And there's a footnote, Scrivener's Introduction, in addition, page 269. The most important of these will be afterwards described, but it is enough at present simply to note the existence of such a wealth of material, in order to feel how abundant is the means with which it has pleased God to furnish us for ascertaining, through careful examination and comparison, the true text of the New Testament. We may now proceed to a consideration of the causes which have given rise to the vast variety of readings that has been mentioned. These causes may perhaps all be embraced under one or other of the following heads. First, there are those differences of reading which have sprung from pure mistake. As universal experience has proved, nothing is more difficult than to get any large amount of mere copying work done with absolute correctness. The transcriber may be careless or incompetent, and then of course his work will be badly done. No doubt this has given rise to not a few of the mistakes which appear in the manuscripts of the New Testament. Some of the copyists knew very little of what they were doing, while others disliked the drudgery, and so from ignorance or weariness they fell into error. But even the most skilful and patient of them might easily go astray in the work of transcription. One word might be mistaken for another. This is often found, even in printed books at the present day. It is needless to quote examples, as all are familiar with the footnote below this. A long list of mistakes which have occurred in the printing of some editions of the Scriptures is given by Dr. Eadie, the English Bible 2318. Among them are such as these: enticed in everything, for enriched in everything, leadeth them not, for leadeth them out, eject, for elect, and more. Yeah, there were some errors found in the King James Version, one of them being a printer with it in regards to the Ten Commandments put, "Thou shalt commit adultery," and once this was discovered, he was fined and lost his license to print that version. And there are a few others. We find accordingly numerous examples of various readings due to such mistakes. It is for instance owing to this that we read in the authorized English version at 1 Timothy 1:4 these words, "rather than godly edifying which is in faith," instead of "rather than a dispensation of God which is in faith," as in the revised version. There is in Greek only the difference of a single letter between the word meaning edification and the word meaning dispensation. Footnote at the bottom. The two Greek words are "and in this particular Greek word is now read instead of another one. So that copyists readily mistook the one for the other. Sometimes a mistake of this kind has taken place without any effect upon the sense, as at Mark verse 14, where the change made in the Greek text, where this Greek word was now read instead of this Greek word. Where the change made in the Greek text has led to no change in the revised version. Again, transcribers were frequently betrayed into error by those words of like ending which occurred in the manuscripts. An illustration in English may be found at Matthew verse 8-9. Both these verses end with the word God, and it is easy to imagine that the eye of a copyist might light on that word at the end of verse 9 instead of verse 8, and thus, after transcribing the one verse, be led to omit the next or leave out the next following. This has been a very fruitful cause of omission in even the best Greek manuscripts. Thus, in perhaps the very oldest copy of the New Testament which we possess, Codex B, this is what they're saying, that's the oldest, when it may not be, to be afterward described, we find that the whole of the verse Matthew 12:47 has been left out, and the reason is quite obvious. Both verse 46 and verse 47 end with the same Greek word, and it's footnote at the bottom. Both verses end with this Greek word. The copyist, looking up at his exemplar after having written verse 46, had his eye attracted by the word at the end of verse 47, and fancying that he had just transcribed that verse, was led to pass it over altogether. He missed that out altogether. But D. Ehrman explains this quite well in one of his video lectures. There can be no question that this is the reason why the second clause in 1 John 2:23 is omitted or left out in several manuscripts, so as to stand marked in the authorized version of doubtful authority. The three last words of both the first and second clauses are exactly the same in Greek, and hence the second clause has been overlooked by some transcribers. There is now no hesitation among biblical scholars as to the genuineness of the clause, and it consequently stands unchallenged, awaiting doctrinal utterance in the Revised Version. Further, mere glosses, doxologies, or liturgical formularies written on the margin of manuscripts were sometimes inadvertently introduced by transcribers into the text. Thus, an unwarranted explanation has been admitted at John verse 3:4. The omission of which in the Revised Version on good grounds of evidence relieves the passage of an obvious difficulty. The doxology of the Lord's Prayer, Matthew 6:13, which seems to have been quite unknown to the early fathers of the Church, probably crept into the text from the margin in like manner. And there can hardly be a doubt that the ecclesiastical formula, Acts 8:37, found in many manuscripts, but certainly not genuine, owed its place to a similar mistake. Nothing could be more natural than that additions from the margin, explanatory, doxological, or rubrical, should occasionally find their way into the body of some of the manuscripts, while yet the mass of authorities remained uncorrupted, and still enable us at the present day to discover for ourselves the original text. Once more, under this head, error would sometimes arise from the unconscious working of the mind of the copyist on the passage before him. Few transcribers could act the part of mere machines. Their minds accompanied their pens. They thought about what they were doing, and this sometimes proved fatal to the perfect accuracy of their work. Supplementary expressions, due to the exercise of their own mental powers, slipped in without their perceiving it or realizing it. Thus at Matthew 18:28, the true reading is simply "pay what thou owest," but it was most natural for a copyist to insert a pronoun so as to read as in the text represented by the authorized version, "pay me what thou owest." Thus, again, the reading of the Revised Version at Luke 24:53 is, "were continually in the temple blessing God," but in not a few manuscripts we find praising and blessing God. There is no reason in such cases to imagine that the variations arose from design on the part of the transcribers. They were men and not machines, and sometimes all unconsciously left the impress of their own thoughts upon their work. Judging by constant experience, nothing is more certain than that unintended supplements would, in this way, be made to the text, and unless he were constantly on the watch, there was even all the more risk that a transcriber would thus be led to deviate from correctness the further he rose above a mere piece of mechanism, and executed his work with interest and intelligence. Hitherto we have been dealing with errors due to pure accident, or errors with which the will of the copyists had nothing to do, and from which we may believe they would have gladly kept free if they could. But we have now to notice, secondly, those differences of reading which have arisen from intention on the part of the transcribers. Unusual expressions were altered. A transcriber meeting with an uncommon word or an ungrammatical construction was strongly tempted to change that into a form with which he was familiar. It might naturally enough occur to him that, in such a case, his predecessor, or the person that came before him, in the work of copying had made a mistake, and that he ought to remove the blemish thus introduced into the sacred text. This tendency to correction has been a very fruitful source of various readings. It operated in many ways. For instance, seeming harshnesses were smoothed. Thus at Matthew 25:3 we read in the Revised Version, "For the foolish, when they took their lamps, took no oil with them." But the initial "for" in the Greek not being liked or understood. There's a footnote indication underneath here. Was exchanged for the reading represented in the Authorized Version. Again, rare forms of words were rejected in favour of the more usual. An example occurs at Romans 14:4, without having any effect upon the sense.